Listen, O children of time, to the tale of Dan, whose love for women was matched only by his blindness to the serpent coiling in his own house. In a village where wealth whispered through narrow streets and gossip traveled faster than the wind, Dan stood as a figure of both admiration and controversy. His compound, sprawling and well-maintained, spoke of riches that seemed to flow endlessly from his hands, but it was not his wealth that made him the talk of every gathering. It was his insatiable love for women that turned heads and loosened tongues. Dan moved through life with the confidence of a man who knew his worth, his eyes forever searching for beauty in female form. Gold jingled in his pockets, and with each coin came a promise, a smile, a moment of attention that made women's hearts flutter. They came to him like moths to flame, drawn by his generosity and charm, and Dan welcomed them all with open arms and an open purse. Yet among all the women who orbited around him like stars around a wealthy sun, one burned brighter and fiercer than the rest. Adaku, his first wife, was not a woman to be trifled with. She carried herself with the dignity of a queen and the temperament of a storm. Her eyes, dark and penetrating, could silence a room with a single glance, and her words, when angry, cut sharper than any blade in the village. Their marriage was a study in contradictions. Dan loved Adaku deeply, cherishing her strength even as he continued his pursuit of other women. She bore him children who grew strong under her watchful eye, maintaining their home with an iron will that matched her fierce devotion. Yet beneath her commanding presence lay a heart that burned with both love and jealousy, a complex emotion that grew more volatile with each wandering glance her husband cast toward another woman. The villagers watched this dance with fascination. They saw how Adaku's face would transform at the sight of Dan speaking too softly to another woman, how her fingers would curl into fists when he laughed too long with a maiden at the market. They whispered about how she could clear a gathering with just the thunder in her steps, yet would gentle her voice to silk when speaking to her children or, in rare moments of peace, to Dan himself. Life in their compound moved to the rhythm of this delicate balance, Dan's endless pursuit of beauty, Adaku's fierce protection of her position, and the children who grew in the spaces between love and tension. Wealth flowed, feasts were celebrated, and the compound rang with the sounds of life and prosperity. But beneath this veneer of domestic harmony, something darker stirred. For every smile Adaku offered her husband, there was a shadow of warning in her eyes. For every gift Dan bestowed upon another woman, there was a price being tallied in his wife's heart. The village elders, wise in the ways of men and marriage, saw the storm gathering on the horizon. But even they could not have predicted how spectacularly this delicate balance would shatter, or how the echo of its breaking would resound through generations to come. The arrival of Ote in Dan's compound was like a gentle breeze entering a fortress. She moved with quiet grace, her voice as soft as morning mist, carrying herself with a humility that initially seemed to please even the watchful Adaku. But appearances, as the village would soon learn, could be deceiving. Behind the compound's high walls, Adaku's true feelings emerged like a snake uncoiling in the sun. She watched Ote's every movement with eyes that burned with barely concealed rage, her previous domain now shared with this gentle intruder. What started as subtle jabs soon transformed into outright tyranny. "Go sweep the compound," Adaku would command, her voice dripping with contempt. "Fetch water from the stream." The orders never ceased, and Ote, true to her nature, obeyed without complaint. The children, taking cues from their mother, turned Ote's daily tasks into entertainment. They would deliberately scatter dirt where she had just swept, their laughter echoing across the compound as she silently began again. Dan, lost in his perpetual pursuit of beauty, remained blind to the quiet suffering of his second wife. But the delicate balance of power in Dan's household was about to shift dramatically with the arrival of Neka. Young, beautiful, and armed with an ambition that matched her looks, Neka entered their lives like a whirlwind. Unlike Ote, she had not come seeking love or even respect. Her eyes were fixed firmly on Dan's wealth, her mind calculating the years until his death would leave her rich and free. The compound's dynamics changed overnight. Where Ote bent like a reed in the wind, Neka stood firm as an Iroko tree. When Adaku attempted to command her as she did Ote, Neka merely laughed, the sound echoing through the compound like a challenge. "I am not your servant," she would say, her eyes flashing with defiance. Even Adaku's children found themselves fetching water at Neka's bidding, their mothers raged powerless against the newcomer's bold spirit. Dan, enchanted by Neka's beauty and spirit, showered her with attention and gifts, blind to the growing tension his favoritism created. The compound became a battlefield of silent glares and whispered threats. Adaku's authority, once absolute, began to crumble in the face of Neka's defiance. Ote, caught between these two powerful forces, retreated further into her quiet world of endless tasks and silent endurance. The villagers who passed by Dan's compound could feel the change in the air. Where once there had been order, albeit strict, now there was chaos barely contained by the walls. They watched as Neka strode confidently through the village markets, dressed in the finest clothes Dan's money could buy, while Adaku seethed in the shadows and Ote worked in silence. The stage was set for a confrontation that would shake the very foundations of their shared home, though none could predict the terrible form it would ultimately take. In the shadowy corners of Dan's compound, an unlikely alliance was forming, born from shared resentment and desperate necessity. Adaku, the proud first wife who had terrorized Ote for so long, now found herself seeking the very woman she had tormented. Their whispered conversations began in the kitchen, away from Neka's sharp eyes and knowing smirks. "We must do something," Adaku murmured one evening, her usual commanding voice softened by conspiracy. Ote, still bearing the emotional scars of Adaku's previous cruelty, listened with cautious interest. Together, they watched as Neka paraded through the compound, her influence over Dan growing stronger with each passing day. The sight of their husband lavishing gifts upon their rival united them in their bitterness. Their plan emerged gradually, shaped by Adaku's cunning and Ote's quiet observations of Dan's weaknesses. They knew their husband well, his wandering eye, his inability to resist a beautiful face, his constant hunger for new conquests. What if Ote ventured, her soft voice carrying an unusual note of calculation? "We found someone even more beautiful than Neka." The answer to their schemes appeared in the form of Tashi, a woman whose beauty seemed almost otherworldly. Tall and graceful, with skin that gleamed like polished bronze in the sunlight, she was exactly what they needed. Her legs seemed endless, her smile carried the sweetness of honey, and her eyes held a depth that could captivate any man's soul. Adaku and Ote orchestrated their plot with meticulous care. They approached Tashi with promises of wealth and status, painting vivid pictures of the luxurious life that awaited her as Dan's wife. "He will give you everything," they assured her, their words dripping with honey-coated venom. "You will want for nothing." The trap was set at the palm wine cellar's store, where Dan often stopped during his evening walks. Tashi was positioned perfectly, her beauty enhanced by the golden light of sunset. As predicted, Dan's eyes found her immediately, drawn to her like a moth to flame. The conspiring wives watched from the shadows as their husband fell into their carefully laid trap, satisfaction gleaming in their eyes. Dan's courtship of Tashi was swift and passionate, his previous wives temporarily forgotten in the rush of new love. He showered her with gifts more lavish than any he had given before, blind to the calculating looks exchanged between Adaku and Ote. When he announced his intention to marry Tashi, making her his fourth wife, the conspirators could barely conceal their triumph. Neka, for the first time since her arrival, felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. She watched helplessly as Dan's attention, once solely hers, turned to the newcomer. But in their satisfaction at Neka's fall from grace, neither Adaku nor Ote could have foreseen how their scheme would spiral beyond their control, setting in motion events that would shatter their world forever. Their victory, sweet as it seemed in that moment, carried within it the seeds of their own destruction. Dawn broke over the village with the promise of an extraordinary feast. From Tashi's kitchen, aromas wafted through the compound, drawing curious neighbors to their windows and making mouths water. Her hands moved with practiced grace as she prepared a meal that would be remembered for generations, though not for the reasons anyone could have imagined. The spices she selected perfumed the air with an intoxicating blend that masked a darker truth. As the sun climbed higher, the compound buzzed with anticipation, yet one crucial detail escaped notice. Dan, the master of the house, was nowhere to be seen. His absence, initially unremarkable, grew more conspicuous as the morning wore on, though the festive atmosphere kept suspicions at bay. The wives and children gathered around the steaming bowls, their faces glowing with anticipation. Tashi served them with a serene smile that betrayed nothing of what was to come. Neka alone seemed troubled, her eyes darting to Dan's empty seat as others praised the exceptional flavor of the meat in the soup. Something in her gut warned her that all was not right. It was Neka who finally voiced her concerns, who pushed past Tashi's calm assurances and led the search that would uncover the horror within. The door to Tashi's room, when opened, revealed a nightmare. There lay Dan, bound and broken, his life force ebbing away from wounds too grotesque to describe. The discovery sent shockwaves through the compound, screams piercing the air that moments before had been filled with the sounds of feasting. But it was Tashi's confession that turned their world completely upside down. Standing before the gathered crowd, her face a mask of cold satisfaction, she spoke words that would haunt the village for years to come. "Yes, I did it," she declared, her voice steady and unflinching. "I cut off his manhood." The crowd recoiled, but she wasn't finished. Her next words brought bile to their throats. "And you've all just eaten it." The revelation sent waves of horror through those who had moments ago been praising her cooking. Women clutched their stomachs, men turned pale, and children began to cry as the full impact of her words sank in. But the nightmare wasn't over. As Tashi continued speaking, she pulled others into her web of horror. "Ask Adaku and Ote," she said, her eyes glinting with a terrible light. "Ask them about their plan to stop Dan from marrying more wives." The crowd turned to the two women, who stood frozen in their shame. Their scheme, born in jealousy and nurtured by resentment, had spawned a monster they couldn't control. The feast that had started as a celebration had become a revelation of darkness, a moment when the veneer of civilization cracked to reveal the savage consequences of unchecked jealousy and revenge. As the village reeled from the shock, the true horror was not just in what Tashi had done, but in how a community's silent acceptance of Dan's behavior had created the perfect conditions for tragedy. Despite the village's most skilled healers' efforts, Dan's fate was sealed the moment Tashi's blade fell. He lingered for 3 days, his once powerful frame growing weaker with each passing hour. The compound, which had witnessed so many of his conquests and celebrations, now stood silent witness to his final breaths. The wives who had schemed and fought over his attention could only watch as the object of their desire slipped away into death's embrace. The village elders gathered beneath the ancient Iroko tree, their faces grave as stone as they contemplated judgment for a crime unprecedented in their community's history. The weight of tradition and justice pressed heavily upon their shoulders. After 3 days of deliberation, they emerged with a verdict that would reshape multiple lives. Tashi stood before them, her previous serenity replaced by a hollow-eyed stare. The elders' pronouncement fell like heavy rain: banishment, immediate and permanent. She would walk out of the village that very evening, carrying nothing but the clothes on her back and the burden of her crimes. The beauty that had once been her weapon would now mark her as an outcast wherever she went. Adaku's fall from grace proved particularly spectacular. The proud first wife, who had once commanded respect and fear in equal measure, was stripped of everything: her status, her home, and her place in the community. Her banishment carried a special sting of humiliation, as she was forced to leave behind the children she had raised with such fierce devotion. Ote, despite her lesser role in the tragedy, could not escape punishment. Her silence and complicity had contributed to the catastrophe, and the elders deemed her unworthy of remaining in the village. Her exile, while less severe in its pronouncement, carried its own weight of shame. The gentle woman who had endured years of abuse would now face an uncertain future beyond the village boundaries. The matter of Dan's considerable wealth required careful consideration. The elders, mindful of the innocent children caught in this web of adult betrayal, designated all of Dan's property and wealth to be held in trust. His children, from all his marriages, would inherit equal shares upon reaching adulthood. Until then, respected relatives were chosen to manage both the inheritance and the children's upbringing. As the sun set on the day of judgment, the village watched 3 women leave through different paths. Tashi walked north, her head held high despite her crimes. Adaku took the eastern road, her final glance back at the compound containing years of loss and regret. Ote disappeared quietly to the south, as she had lived, leaving barely a ripple in her wake. The compound, once vibrant with life and intrigue, fell silent except for the sounds of children. Its grand rooms and courtyards, which had housed so much drama and passion, would now serve as a reminder of how quickly fortune could turn. The villagers, watching the children play in these spaces, whispered prayers that the next generation would learn from the sins of their elders and choose a different path. The tale of Dan's tragic end spread through neighboring villages like wildfire in the dry season, carried by traders and travelers who couldn't resist sharing such a dark and compelling story. Each retelling added new layers of detail and meaning, transforming a local tragedy into a legend that would echo through generations. In marketplaces far beyond their village, merchants would lower their voices when speaking of the four wives who brought down a wealthy man. Have you heard, they would whisper of Dan, whose love for women led him to his doom? Parents began using the story to warn their children about the dangers of excess and the poison of jealousy. Young men, hearing of Dan's fate, would unconsciously cross their legs and think twice about taking multiple wives. The village itself was forever changed. Dan's compound, once the crown jewel of the community, stood as a silent monument to human folly. The children who still lived there grew up under the weight of their parents' infamy. Villagers would cross to the other side of the path when passing by, as if tragedy might be contagious. The local palm wine seller, who had witnessed Tashi's calculated seduction of Dan, would tell customers how the mighty man had sat in that very spot, unknowingly sealing his fate. Years passed, but the story refused to fade. Instead, it grew richer, deeper, more laden with meaning. In the evenings when families gathered around fires, elders would use the tale to teach complex lessons about life, love, and consequences. Remember Dan, they would say, who thought wealth could buy happiness. Remember Adaku, whose pride turned to poison. Remember Ote, whose silence made her complicit. Remember Neka, whose greed brought no satisfaction. And never forget Tashi, whose beauty concealed a heart of darkness. The story became a lens through which the village examined its own values and traditions. The practice of taking multiple wives, once a proud display of wealth and status, became less common. Men who might have followed in Dan's footsteps found themselves hesitating, haunted by the whispers of his ghost. Women who felt the sting of jealousy would remember Adaku's fate and seek to calm their hearts. Even decades later, visitors to the village would notice how the tale had shaped the community. They saw it in the way young couples were counseled before marriage, in the emphasis placed on contentment over acquisition, in the warnings against letting jealousy take root in one's heart. Dan's story had become more than just a cautionary tale. It was now part of the village's DNA, a dark thread woven into the fabric of their collective wisdom. And so the legacy lived on, a reminder that the greatest dangers often come not from outside forces, but from the darkness that can grow within our own homes, nurtured by unchecked emotions and fatal misunderstandings. In the end, Dan's true wealth wasn't in his possessions or his many wives, but in the lasting lesson his tragedy taught to generations yet unborn.